Welcome to Pro-Life Live, the program run by the students where we bring the experts and they bring the answers to discuss all things pro-life. Welcome everyone to Pro-Life Live, the program where we bring the experts and they bring the answers. I'm Michael Lopez, and tonight we are joined by the one and only Stephanie Gray Connors. Stephanie is a pro-life advocate and apologist. She is also the author of Love Unleashes Life. Now, if you do not have this book, folks, what are you doing? There's so much space in your brain that you could fill with information that you can only get from this book. So go get this book, Love Unleashes Life. Stephanie, how are you doing? How have you been this eventful year?
I'm doing well, thank you. I appreciate the plug for the book. I actually have my second book coming out at the end of the year. On the other end of life, I'll actually be doing a pro-life apologetics book on assisted suicide. So your listeners can stay tuned for that as well.
Wow. All right. Well, we'll be looking forward to that for sure. So this is probably going to be the hardest question you've ever gotten, but why are you pro-life?
Well,
thesis of your entire career.
Sure. I mean, I would say that I am pro-life because I believe in human rights, because I believe all human beings are equal and that we should be treated, therefore, as we are, which is as equals. And I believe that the most foundational of all human rights is the right to life. And really, it's that right which is necessary for all other rights to exist. You know, people will speak of, for example, a right to freedom. But if you have no life to exercise freedom, what good is the right to freedom? So really, the right to life is foundational. And so that right, which is inherent to our very existence, means we have it the entirety of our existence. And so because science teaches me that beings which reproduce sexually begin their lives at fertilization, and that your existence and mine began at sperm egg fusion, then it follows the moment someone comes into existence then is the moment the human right to life is bestowed upon us, and therefore it ought to be respected. And so because abortion doesn't respect that right to life, because it denies the youngest among us their value and their dignity, that is why I'm against abortion.
Wow, that's a really good thesis. Have you always been pro-life?
I have. I mean, from my earliest memories, I was very active even as a child in the pro-life movement because both my parents were active, and my mom in particular, she volunteered at a pregnancy care center. So when I was a young child, I would often go with her when she would counsel pregnant girls who were in difficult situations. And when she'd go to hospital when they gave birth, I would accompany her. And so I was very familiar with the topic of abortion from when I was very young. And so I've always loved babies, and therefore from, a fairly young age been aware that abortion hurts babies, and therefore I've always been against abortion since learning about it.
Wow. Yeah, and I know some people argue about, when do we teach children about abortion, and I know some people say, no, that should be kind of a teenager thing. Or I know people like Kristen Hawkins believes, no, you got to teach everyone about abortion, or else someone else will. So.
Right. I think like with any sensitive subject, the key is to communicate to one's child or a child that they happen to encounter with an age-appropriate explanation. And so there are ways, if a child were to see a protest, for example, and it be about abortion, they say, why are those people holding signs, or what's going on? The parents can, explain what pro-life protest is, what abortion is, in a language that would be comprehensible to, let's say, an 8-year-old, and they would explain that differently than if their child was 13 or some other age.
Yeah. So that's really, really well said. Going back to your book, when you say love unleashes life, what does that really mean?
Good question. So in my experience of having dialogue with all kinds of people on the topic of abortion for over 2 decades now. What I've found is that a lot of times I've encountered hostile abortion supporters who can just be very resistant to pro-lifers and to the pro-life message. But what I have found over time is that if in the face of their resistance, I am very patient. If in the face of their hostility, I am kind. If I seek to understand where they're coming from and convey compassion towards them, then I have found really the love that I'm essentially imparting to them through how I interact with them changes their very disposition mid-conversation or by the time the conversation wraps up. And I find that as we get further into the conversation, such individuals suddenly seem more receptive to my message at that point than they were at the beginning. So I would say in a sense then, my love in terms of how I interact with them unleashes life. It gives them a whole new perspective on pro-lifers and how they are receiving us and our message. And then of course there's the very concrete reality that if a pregnant woman is supported through her pregnancy, when she's feeling in crisis, she has pro-lifers rally around her, then that will, through loving her, unleash the life of her preborn child, where she would otherwise be tempted to have an abortion. If she feels the love and support of a pro-life community, is more likely to carry that pregnancy to term.
Wow. Yeah. And I really love that message, because I can't remember who originally said the quote, but when I heard it, I was blown away. It's no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what really I was getting from the book. That message of, no, I actually care about you to have a conversation with you that's fruitful, rather than me being the winner or victor.
Right. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Because really the pro-life message is about respecting all life. And certainly we are focused on the attack of preborn children because that is the most pressing issue in our society today. It's not that there aren't other ones, but that's the particular cause that people have rallied around who fall under the umbrella of pro-life, at least primarily with the focus. But we value the child in the womb because we value all humans, which therefore means we're also pro the lives of the people we're dialoguing with. And so if someone is hostile and uncharitable towards us, we still value them. We still respect them. We don't respect bad ideas. I'm not going to respect bad arguments, but I'm still going to respect a bad arguer. I'm going to be kind and compassionate to the person that I'm interacting with.
Yeah. It's we're not, usually people think pro-lifers are only for the unborn, but it's really, no, we're pro-life, meaning your life. Usually when I, or I know other friends speak to college students on campuses, usually it's their own lives that lead them to not value life. And then they make their decisions on, well, if my life is terrible, then why should other people have life, so they can avoid that life. But I found that, like you said, once we show that value for the person I'm talking to, they'll tend to hopefully value their own life and get the help they need.
Absolutely. That just even that very idea brings to mind one of the points that I often bring up when I'm speaking on the other end of life about assisted suicide, but I think it's also relevant in this topic as well, especially with what you just said, and that's the insights of Dr. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And one of the things he speaks about is he talks about despair, and he says despair is suffering without meaning. He even took that sentence and put a mathematical equation to it. D equals S minus M. So D equals S minus M is despair is suffering without meaning. And so his whole point was the reality is suffering is part of the human experience. All of us will face suffering, but it doesn't follow that we have to despair. And the determining factor of whether or not we despair in light of our suffering is, do we find meaning in the situation that we're in? And so Dr. Frankl's point is, if we help people find meaning in their suffering, and perhaps even because of their suffering, then they won't despair. And he cites this very powerful example of a young woman who was in a car accident, became quadriplegic, and she spends her days watching the news, reading the news, and whenever she comes across a story of someone going through a hardship, maybe a natural disaster, maybe some catastrophic injury from a workplace accident or something, whatever the issue is, if she comes across a news story, she will, like that, she will write the people who are being victimized in some way or who are having tragedies befall them. And she's quadriplegic herself, so she can't actually physically write. So what she does is she calls for an assistant to come to her, put a stick in her mouth, and then she uses the stick to pound out letters on a keyboard in order to write notes of encouragement to those suffering people. And in her particular case, being a quadriplegic, she can't do a lot of things she was able to do before, but she's not despairing even in light of her suffering, because she found meaning directly tied into her suffering. That this newfound time, for example, that she has, the ability to empathize with others, to give encouragement because she herself has been discouraged, that gave her an abundance of meaning in her suffering, and therefore she didn't despair. So whether someone, is in poverty, whether they're facing an unplanned pregnancy, rather than end life, whether it's their own or someone else's, in the case of the preborn child, that would be a reaction of despair. So instead, we want to help them find meaning. What can I do because of this situation? Who can I love in this situation?
Yeah, wow, that's really beautiful. Yeah. There are a lot of pro-life books out there. I want to ask, how did you come to write Love Unleashes Life, and why did you write it? I think I could guess why you wrote it. Was there a particular type of person that you wrote it for?
Yeah, that's a good question. For many years, I started giving talks on abortion when I was 18. I went full time when I was 21, and I just turned 40. So it's been a long time. And they say 40 is the new 30. So, but it's been quite a while that I've been doing that. And so in the early years, many people would ask me, oh, when are you going to write a book, after they would hear me give a talk? And I would always say, I feel that I'm not going to write a book just for the sake of writing a book, just because I want my name on a cover. I'm only going to write a book if I feel I have something new to offer, or something that will enhance what is already out there, which I guess in a sense is still new. And so for many years, I just told people, read my mentor's book. Scott Klusendorf is an amazing pro-life apologist who first inspired me when I was 18, and then trained me in pro-life apologetics and debating and all things related to my pro-life activism. And he has a great book called Pro-Life 101. He, of course, has subsequently written other books, but that book was really like my Bible in the early days of pro-life apologetics. And so for many years, I would tell people, just read Pro-Life 101. And then as the years went on, and I took the theory that I'd read from Scott's book, as well as other pro-lifers' books, I think of Beckwith, Frank Beckwith. He wrote a great book on abortion. Stephen Schwartz also has a great book on abortion. And so after reading all theirs and taking the theory, I was applying it to conversations, and I was seeing some of this stuff works really well. But then there was other stuff where new inspirations would come to me. I would try different analogies that weren't in the books I'd read, and these were working. And so I started to, after many years, basically come up with a collection of material that wasn't written down in the books that I would typically guide people towards. And so I thought, okay, I think I have something to supplement what's already out there. I think I have something new that will improve and build upon the great stuff that exists. And so I decided to put that together. And of course, I hope anyone will read it, even if they support abortion. But in my experience, there was a great need to equip people of faith, of primarily Christians, but of all denominations, whether it's Catholic, evangelical, whatever the case may be, to equip Christians to better articulate the pro-life perspective and to do so in a winsome way, and to know when to use the intellect and when to appeal more to the emotion and reach the heart of the person they're speaking with. And so, you know, how to use sectarian language, how to use non-sectarian language. And so I thought, okay, that's primarily my audience. I want to equip Christians to be winsome, articulate defenders of the pro-life perspective, using the practical insights that I had gleaned over many years of application of theory that I had read in other books.
Wow. Yeah. And, you know, something that I really love about your book is you use a lot of the Socratic dialogue. You give, you know, your, basically you write out your dialogue, and then you write out their response, and then you write back. Which is really helpful for one to see, you know, oh, okay, this is pretty much how they'll respond. Anytime I see any successful person talking about abortion, they're always asking questions, always using the Socratic method. You know, why? I want to get your thoughts. Why do you think it's really successful to ask questions rather than just, hey, you don't know this, man. You're the
Right,
best.
right, yeah. Yes, yeah. So what happens when you ask someone a question? Well, immediately the person who's been asked the question has the wheels start to turn in their own mind, and they think, okay, what is the answer? And that's why questions are powerful, because what they do, or they activate the mind of the person we're communicating with. And when it comes to abortion, a lot of times people will hear rhetoric in defense of abortion that on the surface sounds good. You know, I support a woman's right to choose, reproductive justice. I mean, these are all positive sounding words. And so people just conclude, well, abortion is a right. But when you start to break the slogans down and look more deeply at the issue, at when life begins, at the reality of what abortion does to preborn children, suddenly that rhetoric doesn't sound as good. So when you ask someone, how did you come to that conclusion? Or why do you believe that? Or what if you had a woman wanting an abortion because, let's say, she wanted to go on vacation and she felt her pregnancy was going to get in the way of her holiday, you know, the morning sickness, all of that.
Yeah.
Would that ever justify abortion? And if the person says, oh, no, that's a time where abortion would be wrong, then you ask them why. And so you're activating the mind, and the questions then help the person come to the right conclusion, but not because we've forced something in, but because we've led them down a path where the truth naturally is what's magnetic for them, and that's the direction they end up going in.
Yeah, and you know, I think it also shows interest in the other person rather than it makes it into a conversation rather than a debate.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think once you show that interest in the other person, you start to show that love that you're basically talking about with love unleashes life. Was there a point that you had that epiphany where, oh yes, this is how it should be done, through love, you know, through interest in the other person?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think it was always there. If I think back to even the theory I read in the books and what I was taught, I was very much taught in the early days the importance of the Socratic method of being a good listener. And yet at the same time, I would say it took a lot of practice, and it took a lot of encounters to really grasp the importance of that. So it was always there in theory, and something that I started off with. And yet, as time went on, I saw just how important it was. I don't think I realized the importance of it, the centrality of that, as much as I do now. And that came through countless conversations where I saw the fruits of that strategy, and the conversations where I was more Socratic, I was more inquisitive, were more fruitful than if I just got in speaker mode, kind of like on a soapbox, just presenting at people.
Yeah. And I could definitely relate to the pain of hurting someone that you're talking to because you just want to win or win the argument. So.
It's certainly, yeah. And I mean, I opened my book, as you know, with a story of how I had an exchange with
Yeah.
a young man. And I just found myself getting annoyed with him. And it wasn't something I could hide because he actually called me out for being
Yeah.
rude. And so, yeah, we're not always perfect. We're not perfect. And so, therefore, we're not going to always perfect a most winsome approach in every single conversation. But I think we can get closer to perfect
Hmm.
with more practice, with more study, and with more prayer as well.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And, aside questions, anytime I think of Stephanie Gray Connors, I always think of the storyteller. Uh, the storyteller, the analogies. It's always Stephanie Gray Connors. Well, what do you think is the effective effectiveness of using stories and analogies when discussing difficult topics?
Yeah, so that's something I'm grateful my mentor Scott Klusendorf taught me very early on was the
Mhm.
power of analogies and stories. And the reason that that is so powerful is because stories activate the imagination. It's like we're wired to pay more attention when
Yeah.
something is told in story form. And probably because from the time we're young children, we gravitate towards stories. We always want
Yeah.
stories read to us. When you read a child a story from a book, and as soon as you're done, they say, read it again.
Yeah.
They just they're captivated, they're engaged, and so stories take things we can relate to, visualize, easily imagine, and that's the environment where a principle can be best inserted so that the principle becomes easier to embrace.
Mhm.
So I think, for example, when it comes to the situation of people saying, well, we need abortion because if it's illegal, women will do it anyways. They're going to get hurt in back alley abortions. So
Mhm.
we need to keep abortion legal.
Yeah.
And so what I always say to pro-lifers is there's a couple ways we can respond. We could just respond with the principle,
Mhm.
or we could tell a story. Then the principle would become more clear when told through the story. Now, you could
Yeah.
start with the principle. So at the heart of the pro-life position in that situation is to say, we don't make an action which harms an innocent human being suddenly legal. We don't make that action suddenly legal just to make it safer for those committing the action
Yeah.
if the action itself is inherently immoral, if the action itself is harming, killing, even committing homicide
Mhm.
on innocent human beings. That's the principle. But if you were to just say that, the abortion supporters' eyes might glaze over and say, well, I just don't agree.
Yeah.
So then if you tell an analogy, it can make that point more clear. So the analogy I'll sometimes use is to say, okay, imagine you have a man who shows up at an emergency room
Mhm.
with swollen, bruised, bloody, broken knuckles. Okay, so imagine you're a nurse, and so you're bandaging up his wounds, and then you begin talking to him, and you say, "Sir, what happened that caused all this damage to your hand?" And imagine he responded by saying, "Oh, I was beating my wife tonight, and this resulted."
Mhm.
So I would then ask the abortion supporter, having told this little thought experiment, should we legalize spousal abuse and give the man a boxing glove so that next time he beats his wife, he doesn't hurt his hand?
Mhm.
Now, the obvious answer to that question is no. Of
Yeah.
course, we would never legalize that. Of course, we would never give him a boxing glove. And I would assure the abortion supporter that I agree with them, that
Yeah.
indeed we shouldn't make that behavior legal, that we shouldn't support the man in the choice that he has been making to hurt his wife.
Mhm.
But then I would say, okay, and why wouldn't we? And it's
Yeah.
because we recognize, and then from that story, I pull out the principle. We recognize that we don't make a behavior legal, such as beating one's wife, to make it safer for those committing the behavior if
Mhm.
the behavior itself is inherently immoral and harming an innocent person.
Yeah.
And so that the principle is more clear in the context of the story. Once we then agree with the principle through the analogy, then we can see, okay, if I agree with that principle, then that also has to apply in the situation of abortion. And if the preborn child is human, then yeah, we can't legalize homicide on a young child just so that it's safer for those who commit the act of homicide.
Mhm. Yeah. 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 That's yeah. Stories are, they not only drag the person into the conversation more. But like we've said before, I think they also show more interest in the person as
Right.
well, rather than just, oh, I just wrote down some quick puns, some quick pro-life puns, and now I'm gonna go. You actually bring them in, and you explain to them, and you create this story that helps them. Yeah, I think I sometimes think of it as when you try to teach a child something. You use an analogy, or you use a story.
Right. You walk them through something, right. And it's just like step by step, I want to make this clear. And so the story is really all about bringing clarity to an otherwise confusing topic.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That's really, really well said. Now, you also mentioned this as well, alongside using questions and stories, finding common ground, which I think is getting harder and harder as the years go on. But how do you find common ground with someone when you're talking about such a controversial topic?
Good question. So, I think because it is a controversial topic, you can have the emotions involved and people can get really tense and frustrated.
Yeah.
So the role of common ground is to take that tension and to lower it, to try to drop it down a couple notches. Because whenever we realize we have something in common with the other, particularly when that other is hostile, then that builds a bridge and makes us more receptive to the other. Oh, so you do share at least some of my views.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to seeking out what that common ground is, I often encourage people to think about what is the person communicating but not actually verbalizing. What is behind their words? Because if we can identify what's behind their words, that is often the place of agreement.
Yeah.
That is often the place of common ground. And then we can speak to that. So for example, if someone were to say, abortion is needed in cases of rape. As a pro-lifer, I can't agree with that. I don't believe abortion is needed in cases of rape. But that phrase, abortion is needed in cases of rape, is what's being vocalized, is what is being verbalized.
Right.
But if I were to pause and say, what's behind those words? What else are they communicating in that sentence, but at a level of a whisper almost?
Yeah.
And my answer to that would be, well, what the person is also saying is, to be pregnant from rape, a terrible evil that has traumatized the woman, that is an action she didn't consent to be pregnant from that situation would be really, really hard. That would be really difficult. And so that's also what's being imparted by the abortion supporter. So if the pro-lifer responds to their statement about abortion being needed in cases of rape by saying, I agree with you that to be pregnant from rape would be hard. That to be a victim of sexual assault is an experience of profound trauma.
Yes.
And to then find out on top of that, you are pregnant with a rapist child would be a very challenging situation to be in. I can agree with you on that. And so that's the area of common ground that helps lower the tension, because then the other person is thinking, okay, you're not completely out of touch. You can at least understand the gravity of the situation, and certainly the pro-lifer can. But if we don't articulate that, if we don't speak to what we're sensing, then the person can keep their level of tension high rather than be dropped down.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's those circumstances that are brought up that a pro-lifer, one who is pro-life, needs to dig through to get to the core of the question. What are the unborn? And I certainly hear the rape circumstance brought up a lot. But when you finally get through all those different circumstances that people keep throwing at you, and you finally get to the core, are they alive? What's the best response to when you finally get to, okay, are the preborn alive? I remember reading your book, and you brought up this amazing anecdote and I believe it was someone who said, "Listen, they're not alive." And then you respond with, "Then why are they getting an abortion?" And in my mind, I just heard the mic drop, all the guys screaming, "Oh!" Uh, so yeah.
Sure, and
Yeah.
I'm glad you remember that part. And indeed, that is one of the responses we can make.
Yeah.
If the preborn child is not alive, then why would someone pursue an abortion?
Mm-hmm.
The only reason someone would be going to get an abortion is because in some way they're admitting there is someone else there, that the preborn child is alive and growing, and they don't want that child alive and growing, and therefore they're going to go in and, even if you think about the language, terminate the pregnancy. Well, to terminate means to end, but if you're ending something, then that means that thing has already begun. It's in existence. And so even the language of termination of pregnancy is an admission that there is a life that is there. Another point we could make is to ask someone the question, well, is the preborn child growing? So even in the case of fertilization where you have a one-celled embryo, is that one-celled embryo growing into 2 and then 4 and 8 and doubling every time? And if yes, then it would follow, because of the growth of the embryo, that the embryo is alive. And then, as pro-lifers, not only do we need to make the case the embryo is living, but we also need to make the case that they're human, because there are all kinds of living things that I don't object to being killed. I remember once staying in a friend's condo and there was a living cockroach in it, and I freaked out. And my friend that was traveling with me, we killed that cockroach. So just because something is alive doesn't mean it should be protected. What matters is the thing alive? And then what kind of thing is it? And if the kind of thing is a human thing, and by thing I mean, in the case of a human, a person, another individual, a member of the species Homo sapiens, then by virtue of being alive and being one of us, being a peer in a sense, then we have a responsibility to protect that entity's life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I know for sure they're going to go into, well, all right, it's alive, but is it a person? And then you have to figure out, oh, yes, at what point is it considered a person? And it wouldn't be a good conversation with Stephanie Gray Connors if I didn't bring up an apologetics argument, which one of which is my favorite, being the Polaroid argument. And I was wondering if you could give us a brief explanation of that argument.
Sure, yeah. So to segue into that, when people say the preborn child might be alive, might be a human, but isn't a person, that's where questions are powerful. And we simply ask the question, well, what is a person? We don't assume the other party's definition of a person. We elicit it from them. We ask them what is a person, and if in any way they are of the mindset of someone like Princeton philosophy professor Peter Singer, then they might define a person as someone who's rational, conscious, or self-aware, and therefore argue that the one-celled embryo, while human in that moment, because they lack a brain, is not rational, conscious, or self-aware, and therefore isn't a person. And the pro-life response is to make the point that the very nature of a human embryo is that by design, they are rational, conscious, and self-aware in their being, but due to their age, in other words, their level of development, they are incapable of acting on that nature. It's kind of like if we think about a dog in contrast to a cat. There's lots of differences between dogs and cats, but an obvious one is dogs can bark.
Yeah.
Now, it's possible that you could have a dog that doesn't bark. It's possible that the dog never developed properly in the womb, so its vocal cords were never able to bark, or maybe they did bark, but then their owner moved into a condo and they weren't allowed loud animals, and they had their dog's vocal cords clipped just so they could keep their dog, right? Even if you have a dog that can't bark due to developmental difficulties or due to some thing that has happened to them, like vocal cords being cut, is the dog still a dog? And I think we'd all agree, yes, it is, because by nature of being a dog, it has the inherent capacity to do what dogs do, namely bark. But due to a developmental issue or something we've done, the dog can't currently act on its nature to bark, but it still maintains its identity as a dog. And so the same then is true with preborn humans. If their parents are human, they are human, which means they have within them the human nature to be rational, conscious, and self-aware. They just can't act on it. And then to make that point more clear, that's where this Polaroid analogy can be helpful. I first read about the idea of analogizing the existence of the preborn child at fertilization to a Polaroid in an essay written by Richard Stith. And then I kind of put my own little Scottish spin on it because my background, besides Canadian, is I'm part Scottish. My dad is from Scotland. And so I will often have an audience imagine that they are on vacation and they go to where my dad is from. They go to Scotland and they take a Polaroid camera with them because they want to capture their holiday with printed out pictures, because who prints out their pictures these days, right? So they take a Polaroid instead of their digital camera. And let's imagine while in Scotland, they go to the very famous place in Scotland known as Loch Ness, which of course has the mystery around it that there's a monster in the lake. So I'll have people imagine, okay, imagine you're on a boat tour of Loch Ness and you're taking pictures with your Polaroid camera, and a couple hours into this tour, you look over your shoulder and you actually see the Loch Ness monster, okay? So let's imagine you're so excited, you point your Polaroid in that direction, you snap a photo and the little card comes out. And just as that little card comes out, Nessie goes underwater. So then I'll ask people to consider, would you be disappointed that the Loch Ness monster has disappeared? Now, most people will say, well, no, because you're holding in your hand the proof that the Loch Ness monster is at least there, even if you can't see it anymore. And so I say, correct. And you're thinking, you know, this Polaroid picture that I've captured of the Loch Ness monster is not for my photo album. I'm going to sell it, right? I'm going to make money off it, selling it to newspapers, magazines, proving that what people thought was a myth is actually real. I'll pay off my student loans with it, whatever the thing is, and that someone has debt about. And so you're excited that you have this picture. Now, if we think about Polaroid cameras, when you first take a photo, when that card initially comes out, you kind of see just black, brown, smudgy marks. And then you maybe shake it, and in a couple minutes, you look on that piece of paper and see exactly on the paper what you had been looking at in front of you. So then I'll say to the person I'm dialoguing with, imagine there's someone on the boat tour with you who has never seen a Polaroid camera before. They don't know how the technology works, so they excitedly grab the card to look at Nessie. But because you've just taken the photo and they look at the card, they see those black-brown marks, and they conclude the photo didn't properly take. And so they're super disappointed, and they rip it and they throw it in the lake. And so then I'll say to the person I'm speaking with, would you be disappointed at that point that the individual has thrown your photo out? And people always say, well, yes, that's terrible. And then I say, well, what if they responded to you? Why are you so upset that I threw the picture in the lake, that I ripped it up? Why? Imagine if they say it was just black, brown smudges. Why do you care so much about black, brown smudges? And of course, we all know it isn't just black, brown smudges. And the pro-life response, the person in the boat's response would be to say, wait a minute, it wasn't just black smudges. Everything about the image of the Loch Ness monster was captured in an instant. It just needed time to develop. And so human persons are very much like Polaroid pictures in that who we are in our uniqueness, being genetically distinct from our parents and everyone else for that matter, unless we have an identical twin, who we are comes into existence in an instant, but we do need time to develop. So our rational nature, it's there. Our ability to think and reason, our capacity to love, to communicate, all of that is there by virtue of being human, but we need time to develop. And just as those black smudges need to develop into the fully formed image as you saw it when you took the photo, yes, the preborn child, like an infant or a 5-year-old, also needs time to develop. Even, an infant, is not rational, conscious, and self-aware the way you and I are right now. We're having an intellectual conversation. We're communicating verbally. There's mental processing going on about what is being said. Newborn infants can't do those things currently. But inherently, because they're humans, they have the capacity to do that. And so personhood and the rights of persons should be grounded in being a member of the human family, not in a certain developmental level, because we're all of different developmental levels when we compare one human to the other.
And again, the beauty of using stories, for sure. Yeah, I want to present a scenario to you. Say you're a professor of Persuasive Pro-Life 101, and you are about to teach the first lesson of this class. What would you say should be the first lesson when teaching others how to discuss the pro-life and abortion topic? And then what would you say is the most important, if there is, and if it isn't the first lesson?
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a good question. There's so much one would impart and need to get across when speaking about abortion. I do think, kind of, when you asked me earlier on, why am I pro-life? How would I summarize my position? That how I summarized it really gives us a sense of what that first lesson should be all about, which is, are humans equal, and do we believe in human rights? And so, you know, starting from there, and within then that first lesson, looking at the science of when human beings begin their lives, so that even if we can agree in theory that humans have human rights and that we're all equal, it doesn't follow from that abortion is wrong. We then need to figure out if preborn children are members of the human family. And when we use science to figure that out, then wherever science tells us is when a human being begins his or her life, then that's where all this doctrine about human rights then suddenly applies. And so there would need to be a two-pronged approach in that first lesson, establishing the consensus and agreement and belief in human rights, and then looking to science as to when human beings begin their lives. You know, one of the things I'll often point out when I do talk about human rights doctrines is the United Nations has a document they've adopted called the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in this document, it speaks to a whole bunch of issues, but one of the things it says is, in countries where the death penalty is legal, the death penalty may never be done on a pregnant woman. Now, when I learned that, I was fascinated because, you know, if you think about an issue like the death penalty, like abortion, you can have a heated debate. There are people who are for it, there are people who are against it. And I don't bring this issue up to get into that debate. But in order to make this point, where you have two sides on the death penalty debate, is it right, is it wrong? There is something that they cross the fence on, and they hold the same view. And that is, innocent people should never be killed by the death penalty. Okay, so there's a debate. Should we kill the guilty? Yes, no. There's this back and forth debate. But should we kill the innocent? Suddenly both sides hop on the fence and agree with each other. Yeah, we should never kill innocent people who haven't committed a crime. And so then let's look then to that principle about pregnant women not being allowed to be given the death penalty. If you have two women who are in the same country and have committed the same crime, that according to that country, even if we don't agree with it, according to that country, their crime is deserving of the death penalty. If only one of those two women would actually get the death penalty, why is that? They've committed the same crime. They're in the same country. They should have the same penalty. Why is only one getting the death penalty? And if the answer is because the one not getting the death penalty is pregnant, then that's an admission that even though we have two guilty women, in the body of one of those guilty women is an innocent child. And to give that guilty woman who's pregnant the death penalty would actually be also to give the death penalty to the innocent child. And so if the non-pregnant woman is getting the death penalty, then that's acknowledging, okay, there's a guilty woman and it's only her. But if she's pregnant, now it's a guilty woman and an innocent child. And so what I then say is to people, look, if it would be wrong to kill a preborn child by way of the death penalty, then wouldn't it also be wrong to kill a preborn child by way of abortion?
Yeah. Yeah. I really want to take this hypothetical class. But Stephanie, it was a huge pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, where can people find and follow your work?
Great. Yeah. So please, I encourage anyone watching, listening to go to my website, which is loveunleasheslife.com, loveunleasheslife.com. And you can read my blog, see my events page. I actually have a big debate coming up on Pints with Aquinas, the Matt Fradd show. It will be a live debate against abortionist and first medical director of International Planned Parenthood Federation, Dr. Malcolm Potts. And so if people go to loveunleasheslife.com and check out my events, my schedule, they can see and watch that live, and sign up for my email list and be notified about other things going on.
Awesome. And please don't forget to get the book, Love Unleashes Life. It will unleash your life into love. Again, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, I'll hope to have a wonderful conversation with you sometime soon again.
Great. Well, thanks for having me on.